Hi, I'm Ollie, and in this Politics Explained video, I'm going to go through everything you need to know about hard power and soft power in Edexcel A Level Politics. I'm going to start by having a look at the parts of specification this video covers, before having a look at some key 12 markers and 30 markers you could get asked on this topic in the exam. From there, I'm going to start by giving you an introduction to power and its different types, before going in detail into hard power and soft power, looking not only at what they are, but also the key different types of each of them. And I'm going to finish off the video by looking at some realist and liberal perspectives on power, which if you're pushing for that A star, are really good things to bring into your essays and sometimes the 12 markers as well. Before finally looking at some key arguments on either side about whether hard power or soft power is more effective for a state to achieve its goals in international relations, and they'll be really useful to use in your essays. The notes you can see on your screen are part of an updating textbook on Edexcel A Level Politics, the global politics section of the specification, which you can purchase on the Politics Explained website by clicking on the first link in the description, where you can also find loads of other resources to help you in your Politics A Level, including global politics detailed essay plans and detailed 12 marker plans, detailed essay plans covering every single other part of the course, as well as updated textbooks doing the same, and a place to sign up for tutoring or some live revision webinars we're doing before the exams this year, if that's something you're interested in. Yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. So starting off by looking at the parts of specification this video covers. So this is the first of 5 videos on the channel that cover the 4th subtopic of global politics, and that's power and developments. And quite simply, it's the different types of power, looking at the use and effectiveness of hard power, military and economic, and soft power, diplomatic and cultural. In terms of some key 12 markers and 30 markers you get asked on this in the exam. So as I've mentioned in previous videos, all of the questions in bold here, so these cover the whole of the subtopic 4, power and developments, and all of the questions in bold, there are 12 marker plans on, or essay plans on, depending on if they're 12 markers or 30 markers, to purchase on the Politics Explained website if you're interested. And if you know the questions in bold well, not only are they quite likely questions that are going to come up, you can also really, if you know the content in them well, you can adapt to pretty much any question that can come up and be really well prepared for the exam, as long as, even if you make them yourself, as long as those plans are really, really detailed. In terms of the 12 markers that could come up on this specifically, I think it's quite simple. I think it's most likely to ask for the differences between the effectiveness of hard power and soft power in global politics. And similarities would be a really difficult question, so I think that's really quite a clear one actually for this topic in terms of a 12 marker that could be asked, that you should definitely plan before the exam. In terms of 30 markers, it actually be quite a similar question, but more looking at the effectiveness. So I think the effectiveness or significance, I think. So you could look at whether soft power is more effective than hard power. You could look at whether hard power is more significant in global politics than soft power. A very similar debate in either of them. Of course, you're going to have to make slightly different arguments depending on the particular question, but the content will be quite similar, I think, in there. So that's the kind of key 30 marker you want to practice and prepare for this topic. Let's start then by having a look at an introduction to power and its different types. So power as a concept is actually something that's really, really debated within politics, and if you study politics at university, you'll see there's lots of different ways to define power that are really contrasting. There's a real debate around it. But in quite simple terms, when we think about power in international relations, the way we can think about it is the ability of a state, or a non-state actor of course, to influence the behaviour of others in order to achieve desired outcomes. So it's the power to influence other states, often against their will, or to get them to do something they otherwise wouldn't have done because it's in your interest as a state. The nature and application of power varies significantly based on the context in which it's used. So in international relations, power can shape the policies of nations, guide the behaviour of international organisations, so power within the international community also relates to intergovernmental organisations, influence non-state actors such as multinational corporations and terrorist groups as well. And crucially, what we're going to have a look at in the whole of this video is that there are 2 main types of power. And this was coined by political scientist Joseph Nye in the late 20th century. And these have really become central to understanding the tools that states and actors use on the global stage today. The first one of these is hard power, and that refers to the use of coercive measures. So typically involving military force or economic sanctions. So using hard military power or economic power to compel others to act in a way they otherwise wouldn't. And it's based, so the ability to project hard power in international relations is based on how much resources you have. So if you have a massive military, you have a greater capacity to exert hard power in the international community. Exactly the same if you have a big economy that a lot of other states are dependent on, you have greater economic leverage and greater capacity to exert hard power. Soft power, on the other hand, isn't about forcing states to do what you want them to do. Instead, it's kind of seeking to shape the preferences and opinions of others through kind of cultural appeal and attraction rather than coercion. So it's the ability to influence rather than force effectively. So it relies on cultural influence, diplomacy, and moral authority, where countries try and get other states to come along with them. So again, it's still to try and get states to follow your interests and do things that are in your interests, but rather than forcing states to do so, soft power is about effectively convincing them and bringing them along with you. Understanding the distinctions between these is really critical to analysing how states interact in the global arena. And whilst hard power and soft power are distinct, it's also important to recognise that they do overlap, and the most successful global actors combine both. And that can be something you can call smart power. It's a combination of hard power and soft power. So it's not like some states only use hard power and some states only use soft power. It's far from that, actually. So let's start then by looking in detail at hard power. So as I mentioned, hard power is the use of coercive tactics by states or other actors to influence the actions of others in the international arena. And I've put this in bold because you can learn these definitions. They can actually be really good sometimes using introductions or the start of some of your paragraphs in your 30-mark essays. It's most directly associated with military force and economic measures such as sanctions and financial pressure. And it's compelling others to act in a way they wouldn't otherwise, because if they would otherwise, you wouldn't have to kind of force them to effectively. Joseph Nye kind of emphasised that hard power is often a zero-sum game. And that means that the gain of one actor comes at the expense of another actor. So if I'm using hard power to force a state to do something, they're often losing and I'm winning what they're losing, effectively, rather than both of us winning or both of us losing. Crucially, the use of hard power is often to achieve kind of very specific, concrete goals quickly. And it's kind of really used in seen as international relations as kind of the oldest form of power, effectively. It's traditional and a direct approach to asserting influence, especially when soft power hasn't been effective. The clearest and I think most useful example for hard power you're going to use in your essays is military power. So you use your armed forces, your military, to influence international outcomes. That could be it could be through direct military intervention. It could be through the threat of military action. So, for example, we look at Trump's recent threats to effectively commandeer and invade Greenland and make it part of the United States. On the one hand, he may do so, and that would be geopolitically very advantageous for the United States in terms of the resources and the minerals and the access to the shipping lanes that Greenland would offer. But it may be actually that it's less likely that the US actually intervenes militarily, and much more likely that the threat of intervention gets them more concessions from Denmark's government, or from Greenland, or from the European Union. So it can also be the threat of military action can be a use of hard power to get what you want. And it's really about coercing states into compliance. That may be through invasion, that may be through the threat of invasion, maybe through the threat of military action or bombing, lots of different types of military action, of course. We'll look at a few case studies here. So the first one is the Iraq War. In 2003, the US and the UK led a coalition to invade Iraq with the aim of ousting Saddam Hussein from power. It was kind of based on the false claims that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction. But crucially, they did achieve their goal in removing Saddam Hussein. It demonstrated the use of military hard power to achieve regime change. So that can be a use of hard power to get rid of a leader you don't like and put one in who's a lot more favourable to you. And the US obviously used its overwhelming military force to achieve that regime change. The long-term outcomes were more complicated for the United States, but it achieved its central goal. A more recent example you can look at is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So this is very much Russia had the specific goal of territorial gains. And it did so the only way it was able to do so. Soft power wasn't going to work. Ukraine wasn't going to give up any of its territory. So this was a key aim of Russia as a state, or of the Russian government, in Putin in particular, as a leader. There had to be the use of hard power. And he did so through military intervention, aimed at overthrowing the Ukrainian government and asserting control over Ukrainian territory. And this obviously linked into this also the threat to prevent Ukraine from entering NATO or the European Union. Russia's overwhelming use of force, including tanks, airstrikes, artillery, has targeted both military and civilian infrastructure and ultimately created a war. Another use of military power that's kind of these two previous ones we looked at are war, but this is a bit more of a limited one. But it's been a crucial strategy of the Israeli state for over, well, close to 2 decades now, and that's actually been assassinations and airstrikes against Iran in particular. So Israel sees Iran as a kind of a huge threat to its power and its existence in the Middle East. And it's used military power and this hard power a lot of times to disrupt the potential for Iran to attack Israel, in particular through its nuclear program. Some through airstrikes to get rid of critical infrastructure related to it, but also targeted assassinations. So, for example, there were assassinations of key Iranian nuclear scientists in 2020, for example, and that's really undermined Iran's progress towards developing nuclear weapons. And that's a clear example where Israel has used hard military power to get a key aim of the state. It's been effective in doing so because Iran hasn't been able to, so far, to develop nuclear weapons. The next key kind of part of hard power, key example of hard power, is economic power. And that refers to the use of financial resources or economic leverage to influence the actions of other states. So you can impose sanctions on a state, and that, of course, prevents them or makes it much more difficult and more expensive for them to export, or more expensive for them to import, overall just harming their economy, making things more expensive for their population, harming their overall economic growth, and often actually causing significant hardship for the population. And that can be used, either the threat of that or those direct sanctions could be used to try and extract key aims from a state or to punish a state. And can also ultimately force states to make political or policy changes under the pressure of economic harm, which can not only damage a population but damage a government's popularity as a result. A couple of key examples of this: US sanctions on Iran from 2018 to present. So after the US withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal under Trump, they reimposed severe economic sanctions on Iran, targeting critical sections of their economy, including oil, banking, and shipping. And the goal was kind of to pressure Iran into renegotiating its nuclear program, and also to kind of really curb its regional influence. These sanctions have actually gone longer than since 2018, actually, but so they're before the signing of the JCPOA, actually. But they've had a devastating effect on Iran's economy over the time. But it hasn't ultimately been successful. Despite the economic pressure, Iran hasn't fully complied with US demands, and the vast majority, actually, of the hardship has been felt by the Iranian people rather than the Iranian government. Immediately after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the European Union placed severe sanctions on Russia, as did actually a lot of countries across the world, targeting banks, energy imports like oil and coal, restricting Russia's access to global financial markets. And that has had a massive impact on Russia's economy, which was really close to collapse at one point. A huge drop in GDP, severe inflation, reduced access to technology and resources. But again, it hasn't been successful so far in convincing Russia to stop its war in Ukraine. And then actually, on the other hand, you've actually got another example of economic power. Is Russia's energy leverage over Europe, or previous energy leverage over Europe. So amid the war in Ukraine, Russia used its position as a major supplier of gas to Europe as an economic weapon. So for a number of decades, Russia had actually been the key source of energy imports for Germany in particular, but also a number of other European countries. When Russia invaded Ukraine and the European Union placed significant sanctions on Russia, as we just spoke about, Russia responded by cutting off gas supplies to countries like Germany, which hugely increased gas prices, increased therefore prices for consumers, and that really went to the governments as well across Europe, including in the UK, in kind of contributing to the unpopularity of these governments. And that shows how they could use their economic leverage to put significant pressure on European economies. A final key one, I think you'll use this less than others because it's not like an active use of power. It's just that the kind of existing power that a state might have, and that's structural power. And that's the ability of a state or organization to shape the frameworks and institutions that govern global interactions and decision making. By establishing the rules of the game, so the rules of international institutions, they can influence the behavior of other states in a way that benefits their interests. So though sometimes within international institutions, we might think about soft power in terms of how states try and convince other states to follow their interests, form multilateral trade deals, for example, or multilateral agreements on tackling global challenges such as climate change. There's also key elements of structural power within these organizations and within the international community. The first one of these I'm actually going to have a look at is case study 2, and that's the veto power that the P5 members within the UN Security Council have. That gives them a lot of power to influence international decision making and prevent, for example, peacekeeping missions against their allies or prevent sanctions against their allies. For example, Russia uses veto to block UN Security Council resolution condemning its invasion of Ukraine. They've also consistently blocked resolutions to try and bring humanitarian aid or measures to bring peace in the Syrian civil war. They did for over a decade. And that really shows how the kind of P5 members, it's structural power they have within an institution, and that really is a use of hard power rather than soft power. Perhaps the biggest asset to the United States as a power is its structural power of the US dollar. And that's its status as the global reserve currency. So since the end of World War II, the dollar's been the dominant currency for international trade and financial transactions, particularly in energy markets like oil. So most countries hold their foreign exchange reserves in dollars, and many international debts are in the currency. And this gives the US significant power over global finance and really prevents the kind of real depreciation of the dollar and damage to the US economy as a result. It also allows the US to really easily impose financial sanctions on countries like Iran, Russia, and North Korea by limiting their access to global financial systems when they want to, because countries ultimately rely on the use of the dollar for international trade. And that really is central to the US's outsized influence in global economic decisions. Final key one we can look at, and this has been more of an active one in the development of this strategy in the past 10 years in particular, and that's China's Belt and Road Initiative and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. We're going to look at both of these in more detail when we have a look at in kind of future videos as part of the power and development subtopic. This is a useful one you can use in terms of structural power. It does kind of combine soft power in some elements of it though, soft power, but there's certainly hard power elements to that. And that's through its Belt and Road Initiative. It seeks to reshape global trade routes and build economic dependencies with states. So effectively what it's done is built large infrastructure projects in over 140 countries. These might be roads, these might be ports, these might be train lines. With the idea of creating trade links back to China to improve their trade and their connection to these countries, but also it's giving them significant leverage within a country, because often they own a lot of these infrastructure projects, and particularly they've given the loans for them, and if countries are struggling with the debt repayments, they can use owning those within a country as leverage to get, for example, favourable political aims from a country. For example, they might change to not recognise Taiwan as a nation state anymore, for example. So that's the Belt and Road Initiative. We'll look at that in more detail in a future video as well, but that's another example of China kind of seeking to gain structural power and hard power over other countries. So that was hard power, looking at 3 key types: military power, economic power, and structural power. What we're going to have a look at now is soft power. And this refers to the ability of a state or other actor to shape the preferences or influence the actions of others through attraction and persuasion rather than coercion or force. And that's the key difference between soft power and hard power. It's built on kind of more intangible assets. So it's not like you have a huge military, or you have the US dollar as a global reserve currency, or you're very rich as a country that has lots of assets and lots of oil and lots of economic power. Instead, it's more intangible assets such as culture, values, and diplomacy. And it's not about compelling states to act in another way. It's about kind of bringing them along, appealing to their interests, and trying to get them to agree with you. Nye described soft power as the ability to achieve goals through attraction rather than coercion, and it can lead to longer term influence, as it's less likely to provoke resistance or backlash, which of course military force, the use of military force in particular does. And unlike the kind of zero-sum game that we associate with hard power, where one state loses and one state gains, when we think about soft power, it can often be both states gaining, or at least that's the way it's often framed by a country. There are a number of different examples and types of soft power. The first one I think is cultural influence. I think linked to that you can also bring in hosting sports events. These can be powerful tools for soft power, as they can kind of create admiration and attract states to a state and really project an image of that state to the global international community that can increase their ability to influence other states. For me, the best example of this is actually China hosting the 2008 Beijing Olympics, which is a strategic use of soft power by China. So it was expensive to host the Olympics, but it was really crucial for China, as it was emerging at the time as an economic power, to shape its international image. And through a really highly publicized and extremely successful event, especially the opening ceremony, China showcases its cultural heritage, but also its modern infrastructure and rising global status. Viewed by billions worldwide, and it really helped to shift the international perception of China as a powerful and emerging global player, which helped it in terms of its consequent economic leverage, trade deals with other countries, and how countries were viewing it as a power in the international community. Another example you could look at is Hollywood and American cultural influence. So Hollywood films have a huge global reach, and they've been a key source of soft power for the United States because they're made in the US. They really project American values and ideas such as free market economies, freedom, individualism, democracy. And they create positive associations with the US, at least for some international audiences, making them more receptive to American policies and ideals. And it's helped reinforce America's image as a leader in innovation, creativity, and therefore helped it kind of maintain its image as this global leader, which has helped it have more influence over other states and, for example, gain more favourable trade deals or have more influence in multilateral international negotiations. American music is also an important aspect of soft power. Not only does it reinforce the idea of US cultural dominance, tours by artists can also majorly benefit other countries. So Taylor Swift's Eras tour recently was worth around £1 billion to the UK economy. So that shows how these cultural assets of a country and cultural production can also have a huge impact in benefiting other countries as well, and that can increase their soft power and ability to influence these other countries. The second key point is diplomacy and international reputation. So diplomacy is a central form of soft power where states can build influence through peacefully negotiating with other countries and seeking to get them to come along and support their views and their interests. And in the long term, this fosters a positive international reputation, which if you have that in the long term, you're kind of able to have more influence in whatever happens in the future, whether that be negotiations, international decisions, etc. Then the European Union's diplomatic influence is a good example of this. So the EU is really known now, kind of as the only remaining big global power, as having a real commitment to multilateralism, human rights, and environmental sustainability. It's built a strong international reputation in this, including through its own actions and commitment to these goals, not only through kind of being the biggest global provider of development aid, but also through quite ambitious internal environmental policies aimed at reducing its carbon emissions. Its diplomatic efforts to mediate conflicts, promote global trade, and address climate change have earned it respect as a result. And this has kind of enabled its kind of greater influence in global governance and shaping international norms without having to resort to hard power tactics. We also look at Norway, quite a small state, quite a small economy, that's kind of gained a reputation as a neutral and peace-promoting country, and has therefore been able to play an important role in a number of international mediation efforts. For example, Norway brokered the Oslo Accords between Israel and Palestine in the 1990s, and has mediated conflicts in Sri Lanka, South Sudan, and Colombia. And that shows how its reputation and its soft power has allowed quite a small country to have a bigger influence in key international issues and debates, such as peace processes. A final example of soft power, and this is a bit of a difficult one because it's kind of soft power, kind of hard power, because it's of course the ability to provide foreign aid is dependent on the size of an economy. But I think it fits better in soft power, in my opinion. And that's where states provide financial assistance, humanitarian relief, or development aid to other countries to foster goodwill and strengthen diplomatic ties. So you can look at kind of classic US international development policies, where they might be able to have more influence over a country, exert influence over a country because they're providing them with aid and theoretically supporting the government. Or you can look at more kind of ones linked to events. COVID-19 vaccine diplomacy since 2020 was really important. And this was emerged as a key tool of soft power where countries, especially big countries that were producing a lot of vaccines, use their distribution to enhance their global influence and strengthen diplomatic ties. So by providing free vaccines to smaller countries, you might be able to, you'll benefit in those countries, and you might be able to get some concessions and some favours back in the future in return. For example, Russia uses Sputnik 5 vaccine to build relationships with countries in Eastern Europe, Africa, and Latin America. Both China and Russia framed their vaccine distribution as an act of solidarity, aimed to project a positive image in a way that was trying to improve their soft power and influence in international relations and dislodge the dominance of the United States. The final thing we're going to have a look at then is debates over soft and hard power, first looking at the realist and liberal perspectives on power. So realism views the international system as anarchic, where states are the primary actors, nation states, and they're driven by the pursuit of survival and national interests. So for them, power is crucial for ensuring security of states, particularly hard power, such as the use of military and economic strength, as there's an uncertain competitive environment, and the states have to look out for themselves and protect themselves and project power in order to survive and get their interests. And they very much see power as a zero-sum game, as Nice sees hard power. So hard power for realists is essential because coercion or the threat of force is often necessary to influence other states, and realists tend to be a lot more sceptical over the actual effectiveness and influence of soft power, such as cultural influence or diplomacy, as they argue as those forms of power are insufficient in a world where security dilemmas and competition for resources dominate how states think and how states act in the international system. And because it's such a competitive global environment, where if one state wins, another state loses, states have to use their hard power to project their interests. Liberals, on the other hand, have a more optimistic view of international relations, kind of emphasising the opportunity for cooperation, diplomacy, and institutions to promote peace and stability in the world. So they crucially believe that power isn't just about hard power. They do recognise it's there and it's important and it can be used, but they do see power as a positive sum game and recognise the importance of soft power as well, which they see as playing a really important role in kind of the international community working together to tackle global challenges. So, final thing we're going to have a look at then is the debate over whether hard power or soft power is more effective. First, we've got a number of arguments that hard power is more effective. Starting off with the hard power can simply have immediate results for a state, even if its actions are unpopular, in a way that soft power can't. So if a state desires an outcome or an action that's frowned upon and unpopular with other states in the international community, they're not going to be able to achieve it through persuasion and through soft power. Therefore, they often need to use hard power, economic sanctions, or military force in order to achieve those aims. And soft power simply wouldn't be able to achieve them. That's often if you want immediate results. You might invade a country to achieve territorial gains or regime change that wouldn't have been available through soft power. You might place economic sanctions on a country to stop a country doing something you don't want them to do. You might assassinate a political leader or a scientist to prevent them developing a program or achieve regime change. Those aims simply can't be achieved. Those aims and those kind of immediate results simply can't be achieved by soft power, and hard power provides that. Crucially, hard power also provides deterrence. So if you have a huge military or economic power or structural power, you can use the threat of military or economic retaliation as a deterrent to prevent aggression. And that's crucial, especially for realists. They'd argue that having a strong economy, having a strong military, safeguards you against potential attacks from other countries that are against your own interests as well, and it can kind of act as a security buffer. And finally, sometimes hard power is the only option to prevent aggression and uphold international norms. So particularly if another state is using hard power against you as a state, they're invading you, soft power is not going to do much. You need to have a military, you need to have economic power to fight back, as we saw with the Russia-Ukraine war. Ukraine couldn't kind of try and persuade Russia to stop doing anything. Instead, they had to use that hard power. And of course, they have to use soft power to try and convince other Western states, the US in particular, to support them. So it's a combination, that kind of use of smart power. But if a state's invading you, being aggressive against you, Soft power on its own is going to do nothing. You need that hard power ultimately. On the other hand, you have some arguments that soft power is more effective. Firstly, that it can allow for long-term influence and stability. So while hard power is sometimes necessary to get immediate results, diplomacy, cultural influence, and economic aid can build kind of long-lasting relationships and a long-lasting reputation for your country that can allow you to have long-term influence over states, building partnerships, playing a role in a number of different international events such as conflict resolution. And the use of hard power often kind of fails to do so and instead leads to resentment that can come back actually in the long term to damage a state's interests. That can be seen in the fact that the US intervention in Afghanistan during the Cold War, supported by the Mujahideen, ultimately had strong connections to Al Qaeda that later emerged and attacked the US on 9/11, including the fact that they were both funded by Osama bin Laden. So that really shows that in the kind of long term, hard power might give you immediate results, but it can actually be detrimental in the long term, whereas soft power gives you that long-term influence and is beneficial over the long term. Secondly, soft power is far less costly and controversial in domestic politics. So military interventions and sanctions can lead to enormous economic and human costs. Wars and economic blockades can lead to prolonged suffering for a kind of government's population, the population of a country, not only for the targeted state for using economic sanctions against another country, but if they retaliate, also for your own citizens, and that can really undermine the support of a government with its citizens. So it really carries the risk of damaging your own citizens, damaging their livelihoods and a government's popularity, and also as a result, you also, particularly the use of military force, can entangle states in long, drawn-out conflicts that undermine their initial objectives. So originally there was great US support for the Iraq War. But as it became bogged down and a lot of US soldiers were dying, exactly the same happened with Afghanistan. The US public opinion very much changed, and that resulted, was quite important in Obama and the Republicans losing the 2008 election and Obama winning. So it could be argued this has also been the case with Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has got them bogged down in a long war that seems unlikely to be won very quickly by either side, whilst over 70,000 Russian soldiers have died. On the other hand, soft power can pursue national interests without the financial and human costs and the long-term consequences. And finally, it can be argued that soft power is more effective as it enhances a state's global reputation and legitimacy. So states that successfully wield that soft power are often seen as moral or cooperative leaders in the international community, which can translate into increased influence in global governance and decision-making, the ability to shape the international community. On the other hand, hard power can actually damage a state's reputation significantly and erode its legitimacy. And states that rely too heavily on military intervention or economic sanctions, which do great damage to other countries, can face a global backlash. And this can be seen in the reduced legitimacy and support received by the Israeli state after it killed over 45,000 people now in the Israeli-Gaza war. And this was seen, for example, in the fact that European leaders, for the first time in a long time, were openly criticising Netanyahu when they hadn't before. It shows the kind of detrimental impact that hard power can have on the reputation of a country in a way that soft power doesn't. Finally then, as I mentioned at the start of the video, isn't just using hard power or soft power. The state has to decide. Crucially, the most effective strategies blend the two in what's known as smart power. And that involves using both coercion and attraction to achieve a state's goals. So sometimes you have to use hard power to achieve immediate results, but you combine that with some use of soft power to try and prevent the damage to your state's reputation. And sometimes you only use soft power to try and achieve that kind of long-term influence or in a particular policy area. Yes, smart power as hard power is necessary in some situations, particularly for deterrence or in response to aggression, but soft power is crucial for maintaining legitimacy in the long term. And states that employ a combination of both means that more influence, exert influence more effectively, navigating the kind of immediate challenges and the long-term challenges of the international system. Hopefully that was useful, and those arguments at the end in particular are going to be useful for a potential 30 marker that could come up on hard and soft power. But all of the different types, case studies, etc., you can use them not only in that 30 marker, but also in a potential 12 marker, looking at maybe the differences between the effectiveness of hard and soft power, or the differences between hard and soft power could be a question as well. Please let me know if you have any comments or questions in the comment section below, and I'll see you in the next video.